I was reading through the latest headlines this morning and I stumbled upon an interview that stopped me cold. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian went on the official website of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and said something that I think a lot of people are going to dismiss as rhetoric, but guys, I believe it deserves way more attention than that. He said, and I am quoting from multiple news sources that have verified this, "In my opinion, we are in a full-fledged war with America, Israel, and Europe. They do not want our country to stand on its feet." Now here's the thing. When a sitting president of a country like Iran uses language like full-fledged war, that is not just some off-the-cuff remark. This is deliberate messaging, and it is coming at a moment that could not be more critical. You know what really struck me about this? He is not talking about some future conflict that might happen if diplomacy fails. He is saying this is happening right now, today, as we speak. And then he made this comparison that honestly made me put down my coffee and just stare at my screen for a minute. He said the pressure Iran faces today is worse than the Iran-Iraq war from 1980 to 1988. If you do not know much about that war, it was one of the bloodiest conflicts of the late 20th century. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of deaths, chemical weapons, trench warfare that looked like something out of World War I, entire cities devastated. And Pezeshkian is looking at that and saying, no, what we are dealing with now is actually worse. Now, what is interesting is his reasoning here, and this is where I think a lot of Western analysts are missing the point. During the Iran-Iraq war, he explained that missiles were fired and it was clear where Iran would strike back. The enemy was visible. The battle lines were drawn. You knew who to hit, where to hit them, and how to respond. But today, according to Pezeshkian, the war is being waged on multiple fronts simultaneously: economic, political, cultural, and security, making it far more difficult to respond. And you know what? My take on this is that he is absolutely right about that part. This is not conventional warfare. This is what we call hybrid warfare. And it is messier, more complicated, and in many ways more dangerous than tanks rolling across a border. So I spent the better part of this weekend digging into what this multi-front war actually looks like from Tehran's perspective. And I have got to tell you, the picture that emerges is both more coherent and more alarming than what you are typically going to see in a standard news report. Let us walk through this together, because I think understanding each front helps explain why Pezeshkian is using such stark language. On the economic front, Iran is facing what can only be described as a strangulation campaign. Since President Trump returned to office in January, he revived his maximum pressure strategy, the same approach he pursued during his first term, but I would argue it is actually more aggressive this time around. The goal is explicit: dry up Iran's oil revenues and economically pressure the country until it capitulates on nuclear and regional issues. Now, here is what really gets me about this strategy. It failed during Trump's first term. Let me be clear about that. It did not achieve its objectives. Iran did not come begging for a deal. Instead, it accelerated its nuclear program, expanded its regional influence, and essentially waited out the Trump administration. So my question is, why would anyone expect different results this time? That is not how international pressure works. Countries do not just surrender sovereignty because you make life difficult for them. If anything, it hardens their resolve. But the economic pressure is real, and it is devastating ordinary Iranians. The Iranian rial has plummeted to historic lows. Just this past weekend, on December 28th, protests erupted in Tehran's bazaars after the currency plunged more than 7% in a single day. The dollar surged to 1.44 million rials. Think about that for a second. 1.44 million rials for $1. That is not hyperinflation. That is economic collapse. Videos circulating on social media showed merchants shutting their shops, marching through the markets, chanting, "Shut it down, shut it down." And this is not just about currency speculation. Iran relies heavily on imports for essential goods, grain, medicine, basic necessities. When your currency collapses like this, prices for those imports skyrocket. According to official data, food items have risen by an average of more than 66% over the past year. Monthly wages now average barely $100, far below what Iranian officials themselves say is needed for basic survival. So when Pezeshkian talks about economic war, he is not just speaking in abstract geopolitical terms. He is describing a reality that is causing real suffering for millions of people. And here is where my personal assessment starts to diverge from the standard narrative you are going to hear in Washington. Yes, the sanctions are biting. Yes, they are creating pressure. But are they achieving their strategic objective? I would argue no. In fact, I think they are doing the opposite of what the United States and its allies want. They are strengthening the hardliners in Iran. They are weakening the reformist voices that might actually want to engage with the West, and they are giving the Iranian government a perfect excuse for every economic failure. When people are suffering, the regime can simply point to American sanctions and say, this is their fault, not ours. So strategically, I think this approach is fundamentally flawed. It is creating the very instability that the West claims it wants to prevent. Now, before we dive deeper into the political and security dimensions, I want to pause here for a moment because I realize we have been talking about some pretty heavy stuff, and I have been doing a deep dive into this for hours at a time. You know what has been a lifesaver for me during these marathon research sessions? Having actual nutritious food that I do not have to think about preparing. And that brings me to something I have been using lately that genuinely fits into my routine, especially when I am trying to stay focused on complex geopolitical analysis. Mom's Meals delivers chef-prepared, ready-to-eat healthy meals right to your door. And here is why this matters for someone like me who is juggling a million things. They have options for pretty much any dietary need you can think of. Keto-friendly meals, diabetic-friendly options, high-protein meals for muscle growth, low-carb, low cholesterol for heart health, halal, vegetarian meals, and so much more. I am talking about real variety, not just the same 3 dishes recycled. The meals are designed for convenience, nutrition, and honestly, for anyone with a busy schedule who does not want to sacrifice eating well. Prices start from just $7.99 per meal, which when you think about it is probably less than what you would spend on takeout that leaves you feeling terrible afterward. I have put the link in the description and you can get 50% off your first order if you want to try it. No pressure, but it has been working great for me. Okay, back to our analysis. So we have covered the economic front. But Pezeshkian says this is also political, cultural, and security warfare, all happening at once. Let us talk about the political front, because this is where things get really interesting from a diplomatic perspective. Iran finds itself increasingly isolated. Diplomatic channels that were open just months ago have now frozen completely. Negotiations over Iran's nuclear program that began in April have stalled since the June strikes. And the wild thing is, this diplomatic freeze is not just between Iran and the United States. It is a multilateral isolation campaign. In September, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom triggered what is called the snapback mechanism, reimposing United Nations sanctions that had been lifted under the 2015 nuclear deal. Now, multiple outlets from Reuters to regional media have corroborated this, and if you look at the official statements from these governments, they are remarkably unified in their language. They say Iran has violated its commitments, that it has enriched uranium to levels far beyond what is needed for civilian purposes, and that they had no choice but to restore sanctions. But here is what I find fascinating, and this is where my strategic interpretation comes in. The European powers, these traditional U.S. allies, have essentially become enforcement mechanisms for American policy, and I am not sure that is in their long-term interest. Think about it. Europe is dealing with its own energy crisis, its own inflation problems, its own political divisions, and yet they are signing on to a sanctions regime that primarily serves American and Israeli strategic objectives. Now, what is interesting is whether this is a sustainable position for them, because at some point, the economic costs of these sanctions are going to come back to bite European companies that might want to do business in Iran when this eventually, hopefully, gets resolved. So I see this as a short-term political alignment that might not hold if the pressure campaign drags on for years. Now, the cultural front is something that gets less attention in Western media, but Pezeshkian mentioned it specifically, and it is worth unpacking. When Iranian leaders talk about cultural warfare, they are referring to what they see as efforts to undermine Iranian society from within. This includes everything from social media campaigns that encourage dissent to what they view as the infiltration of Western values that conflict with Iran's Islamic identity to support for opposition groups. Now, I am not endorsing this view, but I think it is important to understand it. From Tehran's perspective, this is not just about politics or economics. It is about identity. It is about sovereignty at a fundamental level. And that makes compromise much harder because you are not just negotiating over uranium enrichment levels. You are negotiating over what kind of country Iran is going to be. And that is a much more existential question. But let us be real here. The security front is where things get most dangerous, and this is where I think Pezeshkian's comparison to the Iran-Iraq war, while rhetorically powerful, actually misses some important nuances. In June, we saw what can only be described as a 12-day war between Israel and Iran. It was triggered by Israeli strikes on Iranian military and nuclear-linked sites, as well as what Iranian authorities describe as civilian areas. According to Iranian authorities, the death toll was around 1,000 people, including senior military commanders and nuclear scientists. Now, outside verification has been limited, and I have got to tell you, I am always skeptical of casualty figures that come from any government during wartime, whether it is Iran, Israel, or anyone else. The fog of war is real, and propaganda is part of warfare. So I take that number with a grain of salt, but we have multiple reports from outlets like Al Jazeera and Defense News that confirm significant strikes did occur and that the death toll was substantial. Iran responded by launching hundreds of missiles and drones toward Israel. International reports put Israel's death toll in the high 20s to low 30s. The United States assisted Israel in intercepting those attacks, which is standard practice for allies. But then the U.S. went further. According to a Reuters report that has been widely cited across international media, the United States struck 3 Iranian nuclear facilities on June 22nd. This is significant. This was not just helping an ally defend itself. This was direct offensive action against Iranian territory. The operation, which the Pentagon reportedly called Midnight Hammer, involved B-2 bombers flying 18-hour missions from Missouri, dropping massive bunker buster bombs on facilities at Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. A U.S. submarine also launched Tomahawk missiles at these sites. This was a major escalation that effectively killed the diplomatic track. Negotiations that had begun in April came to an immediate halt, and from Tehran's perspective, this confirmed what Iranian leaders have long argued, that Israel and the United States operate as a unified force in the region, with American military power backing Israeli actions unconditionally. Look, I understand the strategic logic from Washington's perspective. They wanted to set back Iran's nuclear program, show strength, support an ally, but here's what I think they got wrong. By directly striking Iran, they removed any plausible deniability. They made the United States a direct combatant, and that made it politically impossible for any Iranian leader, even a reformist like Pezeshkian, to continue negotiations. You cannot be bombing a country one day and then ask them to sit down at the negotiating table the next. It just does not work that way. Since those June strikes, President Trump has revived his maximum pressure policy. This is the comprehensive sanctions approach designed to strangle Iran's economy. And I have got to be honest with you, when I look at the history of this policy, I see a pattern of failure. It did not work during Trump's first term. Iran didn't capitulate. It accelerated its nuclear program. It expanded regional influence. So why would anyone think it would work now? This is where I disagree with the prevailing narrative in Washington. There is this belief that if you just squeeze hard enough, the other side will break. But that assumes that the other side has no alternative, no options, no capacity to endure pain. And that assumption, when it comes to Iran, is fundamentally flawed. Iran has options. It has regional allies. It has support from other major powers like Russia and China. It is part of the BRICS grouping, which is trying to build alternative financial systems that bypass the US dollar. So while the pressure is real and painful, it is not existential in the way that some policymakers seem to think it is. And that is a dangerous miscalculation. Now, here's where things get really concerning for me. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu just met with President Trump at Mar-a-Lago this past weekend. Multiple sources, including CNN and Axios, have reported that Netanyahu came with a specific agenda. He wanted to discuss potential future military options regarding Iran's missile program, according to NBC News reporting that has been corroborated by other outlets. Israeli officials believe Iran is rebuilding ballistic missile production sites and repairing air defense systems damaged during the June conflict. Israeli military chief Eyal Zamir reportedly raised these concerns directly with U.S. Central Command Chief Admiral Brad Cooper, warning that Iranian missile movements could be used as cover for a surprise operation targeting Israel. So Netanyahu's focus at Mar-a-Lago was reportedly Iran's missile capabilities, and this would represent another significant escalation. The June strikes targeted nuclear facilities. Strikes on missile production would target Iran's conventional deterrent, its ability to respond to attacks. From Iran's perspective, this would be an attempt to disarm the country entirely, to leave it defenseless against future aggression. And I have got to tell you, from a strategic standpoint, that is a terrible idea. Here is why I think that. Pezeshkian's message to the West was clear. Iran is not backing down. He said, "Our dear military forces are doing their jobs with strength, and now in terms of equipment and manpower, despite all the problems we have, they are stronger than when Israel and the US attacked." Now, is that true? I do not know. I am skeptical of any claim that a country emerges stronger after being bombed. That sounds like bravado. But what I think he is really saying is that Iran has learned from the June conflict. It has adapted, it has hardened its defenses, and it is prepared to escalate if attacked again. He continued, "So if they want to attack, they will naturally face a more decisive response." Look, I do not think this is empty rhetoric. Iran demonstrated in June that it can strike Israeli territory. It launched hundreds of missiles and drones. Yes, many were intercepted, but some got through. And Iran's regional allies extend its reach. Hezbollah in Lebanon, various militias in Iraq and Syria, the Houthis in Yemen, who have demonstrated the ability to disrupt global shipping in the Red Sea. A new round of strikes against Iran would likely trigger responses across the region, not just from Iran directly, but from this entire network of allies. This is the danger of the current trajectory. Each escalation provokes a response. Each response provokes further escalation, and the cycle continues until someone miscalculates or decides that full-scale war is preferable to continued tension. And that is what worries me most here. Because when you look at the fundamental dispute at the heart of this confrontation, it is about Iran's nuclear program. The United States and its allies accuse Iran of seeking nuclear weapons. Iran denies this, insists its program is peaceful, focused on energy and medical research. This dispute has lasted decades. It was the subject of the 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, which placed limits on Iran's activities in exchange for sanctions relief. Trump withdrew from that deal during his first term. Since then, Iran has gradually exceeded the deal's limits, enriching uranium to higher levels. Now, European governments say that UN sanctions snapped back on Iran in September, and here is what I think is important to understand about this. According to a joint statement from the foreign ministers of France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, which I have read in full, they triggered this mechanism because Iran has a stockpile of enriched uranium that is 48 times the JCPOA limit. 48 times. They say Iran has no credible civilian justification for this. And you know what? That is a valid concern. If you are enriching uranium far beyond what you need for power plants or medical isotopes, that raises legitimate questions about your intentions. But here is my strategic interpretation of this. The Europeans are in a tough position. They want to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. That is a legitimate goal. But they also know that sanctions alone are not going to achieve that. They have seen this movie before. Iran is not North Korea. It is not isolated. It has options. So this snapback of sanctions, while it sends a political message, I think it is ultimately a symbolic gesture that will not change Iranian behavior. What would change Iranian behavior is a negotiated settlement that gives Iran a path back to the global economy while providing verifiable limits on its nuclear program. But that requires diplomacy. And diplomacy requires channels that are currently frozen. And that brings me to what I think is the most dangerous aspect of this whole situation. The diplomatic freeze means there is no off-ramp. There is no way to de-escalate when a crisis emerges. When diplomacy fails, the only remaining options are pressure and military force, and both sides appear to be moving in that direction. Iran is rebuilding its capabilities. Israel is reportedly planning additional strikes. The United States is tightening sanctions while keeping military options on the table. Without diplomatic channels, miscalculation becomes more likely. A crisis could spiral into war before anyone has a chance to pump the brakes. Now, I want to zoom out for a moment and talk about the broader context here because I think this confrontation is about more than just Iran's nuclear program. It is part of a larger pattern of great power competition. Russia and China have both maintained relationships with Iran despite Western pressure. Iran has become an important partner for Russia, providing drones used in Ukraine. The BRICS grouping, which includes Russia, China, India, Brazil, and South Africa, is expanding its influence as an alternative to Western-dominated institutions. From this perspective, Western pressure on Iran is part of a larger effort to maintain American and European influence in a world that is becoming increasingly multipolar. And here's where I think my analysis diverges from what you will hear in mainstream foreign policy circles. I believe that the United States is overplaying its hand. It is trying to maintain a unilateral dominance in a world that is fundamentally shifting toward multipolarity. And countries like Iran, for all their internal problems and legitimate criticisms of their government, are part of that shift. They are choosing resistance over submission because they believe, rightly or wrongly, that the alternative is to become a vassal state. They look at what happened to Libya after it gave up its nuclear program. They look at what happened to Iraq, and they say, no, thank you. That calculation might be based on selective history, but it is a real calculation that drives their behavior. So what are the broader implications if this continues to escalate? Let us game this out together. If we see more strikes, more retaliation, more escalation, the result could be a regional war involving Iran, Israel, the United States, and potentially other countries like Saudi Arabia or the UAE. Such a war would devastate the Middle East. It would disrupt global oil supplies, spike energy prices, and send shockwaves through the global economy. I am talking about potential oil prices at $200 a barrel or higher. I am talking about American forces in Iraq and Syria facing attacks from Iranian-backed militias. I am talking about Israel facing missile barrages that challenge even its sophisticated air defenses. The cost would be enormous in lives, in treasure, and in regional stability. Iran's economy is hurting badly, but the regime has not collapsed. In fact, the currency collapse and protests we are seeing might actually strengthen the regime's narrative that they are under attack from external forces, allowing them to rally nationalist sentiment. Meanwhile, the United States is dealing with its own political divisions, its own economic challenges, and frankly, war fatigue after decades of Middle Eastern conflicts. The American public has very little appetite for another major war in that region, so there is an incentive on both sides to eventually find a way back to the table. The question is how much damage gets done before that happens. So here's my conclusion after digging into all of this. Pezeshkian's declaration that Iran is in a full-fledged war with America, Israel, and Europe is not just rhetoric. It is an accurate description of what is happening from Tehran's perspective. This is a multi-front pressure campaign that is unprecedented in its scope and complexity. But it is also a war that no one can win through military means alone. The only way this ends is through a negotiated settlement that addresses the legitimate security concerns of all parties. And that seems very far away right now. The decisions that get made in the coming weeks and months, whether at Mar-a-Lago or in Tehran, are going to shape the future of the Middle East for a generation. And what concerns me most is that the voices calling for restraint, the voices advocating for diplomacy, they are being drowned out by the drums of war. So I will be watching this extremely closely, and I think you should too, because this is not just about Iran. This is about what kind of international order we are going to live in for the next several decades. If you found this analysis helpful, if it gave you a different perspective than what you are hearing elsewhere, I would really appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and do not forget to smash that notification bell so you get updated when I post my next analysis. Thanks for watching, guys. I will see you in the next one.